I saw my wife at the bar, laughing as if the world around her had no weight at all. She was with him, the man she had been cheating on me with. A betrayal that I had already intuited for some time, but that today was revealed to be cruelly explicit, right in front of me. When our eyes met, her expression froze, the smile died before it was fully formed, and I knew right then and there that whatever lie she had prepared would no longer work. She tried to come to me, hesitantly, and gave the lame excuse I was already expecting to hear: he's just a friend. Just a friend, as if that was enough to erase the image burned in my mind. His eyes were desperate, begging for a chance to explain, but I had already made my decision. There would be no conversation, there would be no second chances. I was determined to put an end to this farce of a marriage. It all started a few months ago. Small changes, too subtle to be noticed immediately, but over time they became difficult to ignore. She spent more time on the phone, smiled differently, quickly hung up calls when I entered the room, or said it was just work matters. There were also those frequent night outs, always with excuses too convincing to be true. A work meeting, meeting a friend who needed to vent. I wanted to believe, and I forced myself to believe for a while, but the intuition that told me not to be naive grew inside me like a shadow. And so that night I decided to follow her. She said she was going to meet a colleague for a quick coffee, but something about the way she dressed up, the choice of dress, the perfume, nothing suited a simple casual meeting. When she left, I waited a few minutes and followed, my mind torn between the foolish hope that I was mistaken and the devastating fear of discovering the truth. She walked into that elegant bar downtown, and I soon saw that she wasn't alone. He was already there, sitting casually, as if this was the place they were always supposed to be. They were close, too close to be just friends. The way he touched her arm, the way she tilted her head and smiled at him, every detail burned me inside, making it impossible to ignore what was before my eyes. As I watched them from afar, a mix of anger and sadness took over me. The anger of having been deceived, manipulated, and the sadness of realizing that the love we built, or that I believed I had built, had become a blatant lie. I stood there, paralyzed, as every laugh and every touch between them cut like a sharp blade. That night was the beginning of the end. And the end came quickly. The next morning, still in the heat of my grief, I confronted her. "So, that's it?" I asked, and she tried to deny it, tried to say that I was imagining things, that I was exaggerating. But her words sounded empty, without conviction, and I knew she had been caught. "There's no point in lying. I saw you. I saw how he looks at you, and I saw how you respond. There's nothing more you can say to change that." She cried, said it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing. That I was confused, lost, that I didn't want to lose myself. Words that might have worked if I still believed anything she said. But I no longer believed it. My heart, once full of love and trust, was now just an empty space, corroded by betrayal. And that's when things started to change unexpectedly. From the moment I decided that divorce was the only way, I wanted to do everything right, fairly, even if there was no justice in what she had done to me. But as I laid the groundwork for the breakup, as I picked up the pieces to move away from that toxic relationship, something sinister emerged on her side. I discovered, almost by chance, that her lover was not just any man. Through some contacts and a little investigation, I came across information that changed the game. He was involved in something much darker, something that went far beyond an extramarital affair. Money laundering, illegal operations, an underworld that I never imagined would touch my life. Suddenly, my wife's betrayal was not just a case of emotional infidelity, but a connection to crimes that could ruin her in ways she only dreamed of. "He's just a friend," she said, and now I realized how dangerously inappropriate those words were. Because if she was involved with him, if there was any kind of financial or personal connection that could be used against her, everything she had built, every future she thought she had, could disappear in the blink of an eye. So here I was, faced with a choice: go through with the divorce and let her sink into the mess of her own making, or use what I knew to turn the situation in my favor, maybe save something in the process. But did she deserve to be saved? Was I willing to get my hands dirty to secure an advantage in this dirty game? Every moment that passed, I wondered how things got to this point. When did the woman I loved so much, who I trusted with my life, decide to risk everything for a hopeless romance and, even worse, get involved in something so dangerous? And now, she was about to face the consequences of her actions in ways she could never have predicted. Because when you play with fire, you eventually get burned, and I was determined to make her feel the heat of the flames she herself lit. She thought she could control everything, that she could lie and get away with it, but the truth has a cruel way of coming out, and the price for ignoring it is always high. But I didn't count on one last twist. Something that could change everything, something that neither she nor I expected. Because there are things that are beyond our control, secrets that remain hidden, but that, once revealed, have the power to destroy everything and everyone around them. And that's why, that night, when she walked into the house and saw the divorce papers on the table, I saw a new kind of desperation in her eyes. A despair that went beyond betrayal, beyond the fear of losing the comfort and security of marriage. It was the fear that everything she hid, everything she thought she could keep from my sight, would finally come to light. But what I still didn't know was that there was more at stake than I could imagine. Something I was about to discover, and that would forever change the way I saw my wife, the man she cheated on me with, and the fate that awaited us. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they clearly show how infidelity can destroy lives, families and dreams. Our goal is to reveal the dark side of bad choices and their inevitable consequences. Get ready for a shocking story, full of twists and intense emotions. Good story. James has always been a methodical man. At 38 years old, his life revolved around a well-planned and stable routine, something he considered an achievement. After years of working hard, he managed to establish himself as an operations manager in a logistics company, a position that guaranteed him a good salary and the security he had always sought. He was the type who came home at the same time every day, liked to plan his meals for the week and believed that the secret to a lasting marriage was predictability and consistency. Maybe that's why, when he looked at Sarah, his wife, he always felt like he had made the right choice. Sarah was 35 years old and was everything James admired, intelligent, charming and, at the same time, with a sweetness that contrasted with her vibrant energy. She worked as an interior designer, a profession that allowed her to express her creativity and made her feel fulfilled. Unlike James, who liked things organized and predictable, Sarah was spontaneous. He liked to try new restaurants, got lost in bookstores for hours, and didn't hesitate to make last-minute plans. Maybe that was the reason their marriage worked, where one was firm and stable, the other was light and impulsive, a complementarity that, in everyone's eyes, made them a perfect couple. The two met in a cafe. James had just gotten out of a stressful meeting, and Sarah was there, sitting at the next table, doodling in her sketchbook. The conversation started by chance, when he offered to help pick up a napkin she had dropped. A simple gesture that turned into a meeting lasting several hours, as if neither of them wanted that moment to end. Since then, everything between them seemed easy and natural. The relationship progressed quickly, and within 2 years they were married. James loved the way Sarah could bring color and movement to her dull, calculated life, while Sarah felt secure in the stability James offered. Over the years, the couple built a comfortable life. They bought a house in a quiet neighborhood and decorated each room together, mixing Sarah's styles with James's practicality. The house reflected an almost perfect balance between them. On the walls, photos of travel, laughter and unforgettable moments, silent witnesses of a love that seemed genuine. For James, every detail there was proof that his life was on the right path. But for Sarah, things had started to change. What was once exciting and full of new things began to feel like an endless routine. James remained methodical and predictable, and although she appreciated that in some ways, there were times when she missed the spontaneity that used to define her life. She found herself thinking more and more about how repetitive, almost suffocating, things had become, and the idea of always being the perfect wife, living a perfect life, began to take a toll. Still, she blamed herself for these thoughts. After all, James was good to her. He never raised his voice, never treated her disrespectfully, and always did his best to make her feel loved. So why did she sometimes feel like something was missing? Sarah's doubts began to arise silently, without fanfare, during the most ordinary days. One night, she came home after a long day of work, exhausted and with a restless mind. James was already in the kitchen, preparing dinner, as he did every night. He smiled at her, asked her about her day, and made the same usual comment about the city's traffic. She smiled back, but inside, she felt a sadness she couldn't explain. James, for his part, was unable to see what was happening. To him, things were fine, and if there was something wrong, Sarah would tell him. This was the kind of relationship he believed they had, open and honest. James was not a man for great displays of affection, but he liked small routines that, for him, symbolized affection and care. He made Sarah breakfast every day, left occasional love notes in her purse, and made sure to turn off his phone when they were together so they could enjoy each other. He knew that Sarah's work was stressful and wanted her to feel welcome and at peace, at least at home. Somewhere in his mind, he felt that these small actions were enough to keep the flame of love they shared alive. But things started to become more difficult. Sarah began arriving late more frequently, citing projects that required overtime. James, always trusting, never questioned. He just made sure to leave dinner warm for when she arrived, and sometimes he even waited up to kiss her goodnight. The love he had for Sarah seemed unshakable, even though she was slowly drifting away. For him, all they needed was a trip to reconnect, a weekend away from everything and everyone. It was just a phase, I thought. Every relationship goes through this. Sarah, on the other hand, no longer knew how to deal with the feeling of restlessness that took over her chest. She found herself torn between guilt for no longer being the attentive, loving wife James deserved, and a desire for something she couldn't define. Something that pulled her away from that life that suddenly seemed too small. She tried to fill this void with her work, diving into new projects, accepting more and more commitments and moving away, without realizing it, from James and what they had built together. In recent months, she has started going out drinking more often after work. At first, they were harmless meetings with coworkers, a way to relieve stress and avoid facing the monotony of returning home. But eventually, she met new people. Some of these outings became more personal, encounters that offered an escape from the predictable reality she lived with James. And although she had never planned to, she found herself enjoying this new sense of freedom, as if she was rediscovering parts of herself that she had left behind. For James, life remained the same. He noticed that Sarah was distant, but attributed it to tiredness. I believed that she needed space, that with time everything would return to normal. Therefore, he did not hesitate to make plans for the future. A future he saw clearly, where they grew old together, in the same house, with the same stability and comfort he had worked so hard to build. What he didn't see was the whirlwind of emotions that stirred inside Sarah, nor the storm that was approaching, ready to destroy everything he considered right and safe. And as the two continued to play their roles, the devoted husband and the independent wife, something was about to happen. Something that would force James to see his life in a completely new light and to realize that sometimes what appears to be stability and security can hide a much darker truth. Sarah's work increasingly became a kind of refuge, a place where she could escape the dilemmas that followed her home. Her projects were more ambitious, and she threw herself into them with an intensity that she hadn't shown in a long time. Maybe it was an attempt to prove herself, to fill a void that seemed to grow every day. Working nights extended into the early hours, and outings to decompress with colleagues became more frequent, more intimate. James watched everything with a mixture of concern and patience. He believed that if there was something wrong, Sarah would come to him. But every time he tried to talk about how busy she was, or how they seemed to see less of each other, Sarah was evasive, saying that everything would be calmer soon, that he didn't need to worry. James tried to believe it, tried to ignore the twinge of uneasiness that appeared every time she arrived home with that forced smile, her makeup a little smudged, and her distant gaze. But the feeling that something was out of place grew. He couldn't put his finger on it, he just knew something was wrong, that the safe routine he cherished was slipping through his fingers. One particular night, as Sarah was getting ready to leave, James watched her from the corner of the room. She had said she was going to a happy hour to celebrate closing a big contract, and he tried to sound excited and asked if she needed a ride. "No, dear. I'm going with Julie, everything is already arranged." Her smile was warm, but something in the tone of her voice seemed distant. He didn't insist, but before she left, he asked if they could do something together over the weekend. She hesitated, as if trying to formulate an acceptable answer, and then said yes, of course, and that they needed this break. "I think it would be good for both of us." James smiled, an almost relieved smile, and kissed her forehead. But as the door closed behind her, he couldn't help but wonder if she truly believed her words. He felt like an idiot for not confronting her more directly, for letting the days pass without demanding answers. But he didn't want to be the kind of husband who suffocated, who accused without proof. Still, that night was different. When she left, James took out his cell phone and, almost on impulse, opened the tracking app they had installed years ago when Sarah had her car stolen. He hesitated for a few seconds before activating the tracker, as if he knew he was about to cross a line from which he could not return. But he did it anyway. The location showed a bar downtown, an elegant and modern place that they rarely frequented. James knew this wasn't the kind of place for a casual happy hour with coworkers, but he tried to calm his thoughts and focus on something else. However, his uneasiness was stronger, and, without realizing it, he was already picking up the car keys, determined to go there and see for himself. Maybe I'm exaggerating, he thought as he drove, but part of him already knew he was about to face a truth he had avoided for a long time. When he arrived, he parked on a corner and entered the bar. The music was loud, the lights were soft and elegant, creating an atmosphere that seemed to have been designed to hide secrets. James looked around, looking for Sarah among the tables, feeling his heart beat faster with each step he took. And then he saw her. Sitting at a table at the back of the room, facing a man he had never seen before. She was leaning forward, her arms resting on the table, as if everything else in the world had disappeared. James felt a knot in his stomach when he saw the way she smiled at him, the sparkle in her eyes that seemed to have disappeared when she was home. The man touched her hand, and Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled and let his fingers intertwine with hers. At that moment, James realized it wasn't just a casual touch, it was a gesture of intimacy, a reflection of something that had grown without him realizing it. He stood still, watching, as a feeling of emptiness began to spread throughout his body. It was as if the world around him had gone silent, the voices muffled, the music distant. James knew there was something there that couldn't be explained away with excuses, and the certainty of betrayal fell on him like a sledgehammer. He wanted to turn his back and walk away, pretend he had never seen anything, but he knew he couldn't live with the doubt. So he decided to wait. After a while, the man got up and went to the bar to get more drinks, leaving Sarah alone at the table. James saw his chance and approached, trying to maintain the calm he knew he didn't feel. When Sarah saw him, her face turned pale. She tried to hide her surprise, but the truth was too obvious to hide. "James, what are you doing here?" he asked, forcing a nervous smile. James didn't respond right away. He looked at her, trying to find some trace of the woman he had married, but all he saw was a stranger, someone he could no longer recognize. "I should be the one to ask that," he replied, his voice low and contained, but full of pain. "So, is it like this? Do you think I'm an idiot, that I don't see what's going on?" Sarah tried to stammer out an excuse, but James wouldn't listen. Everything seemed to fall apart inside him, and he knew that no matter how hard she tried, there wouldn't be enough excuses to erase what he had just seen. "Are you going to go back to the table with that man and pretend I'm not here?" he asked, almost like a challenge. "Or will you have the decency to tell me the truth?" She hesitated for a moment, as if struggling to find the right words. But before he could respond, the man returned, carrying the drinks. He looked from Sarah to James, clearly confused, and then he understood. It was as if the tension in the air became palpable, suffocating. "Sarah, who is he?" he asked, trying to sound unconcerned, but the hesitation in his voice betrayed his insecurity. James didn't need anything else. "I'm her husband," he said, and the words cut through the silence like a blade. "And now I finally know the truth." James couldn't sleep. After the confrontation in the bar, he spent the entire night awake, staring at the ceiling, while tumultuous thoughts danced in his mind. He didn't know how to deal with the weight of Sarah's betrayal, didn't know how to process the pain that was spreading through his chest like poison. There were moments when he wanted to believe that this was a nightmare, that when he closed his eyes and opened them again, everything would return to normal. But reality was merciless, and he could not escape. Sarah returned home hours later, in silence. The attempt to explain the inexplicable in the bar had failed miserably. She tried to follow him when he left, but James simply ignored her and walked away, leaving her alone with her lover, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a sentence. When she walked through the door, she tried to start a conversation, but James walked away, cold and distant, unable to look at her without feeling a mix of anger and overwhelming sadness. The next day was an endless drag of minutes. Sarah was restless, pacing back and forth around the house, trying to find the courage to talk to James, to give an explanation that she herself knew didn't exist. She was wrong, and she knew it, but the truth was that her relationship with her lover was not as simple as it seemed. There was a bigger secret she was desperately trying to hide, a secret that could devastate not just her marriage, but everything she knew. When James returned from work, the atmosphere between them was unbearable. He ignored her, went straight to the kitchen and opened a bottle of wine, pouring himself a glass without even looking at her. Sarah watched him from the hallway, her hands shaking, knowing she needed to do something before the situation got even more out of control. "James, please, we need to talk," she said, her voice low, almost pleading. He turned to her finally, with a look that made her shudder. There was a mix of tiredness and disappointment in his eyes, an expression of someone who was losing a battle he didn't even want to fight. "Conversation." "Sarah, what else can you say?" "I've seen everything I needed to see," he replied, his voice thick with bitterness. "Do you have any idea how much this destroyed me? How hard did I try to ignore what was in front of me, only to discover that I was the idiot in the story?" She took a step forward, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I'm very sorry. I know nothing I say will fix what I did, but it's not that simple, James. There's more going on." "Ah, of course there is more. But you never had the decency to tell me. So now please enlighten me. Tell me what truth you thought I didn't need to know," he said, each word coming out like a punch, forcing her to face what she had done. Sarah hesitated. She knew that once she said those words, there would be no turning back. But she also knew that the truth had to come out, that James needed to know everything, even if it meant the definitive end between them. She took a deep breath and began, feeling the weight of the secret tightening her chest. "He isn't just a man I've been involved with, James," she began, her voice trembling. "He's involved in things you don't understand, illegal things, and I ended up involved in it." James looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about? What does this mean? Did you know he was doing something illegal and you still chose to be with him?" "I didn't know at first," she exclaimed, trying to keep her voice steady but clearly struggling not to lose control. "He approached me as a client, I started decorating his apartment, and things just evolved. I was fragile, confused, and he seemed like a distraction from life that I no longer knew how to deal with. But then I started to realize that he was using the decorating business to launder money, and when I tried to walk away, it was too late. He threatened me, James. James frowned, processing what she had just said. Are you saying you are involved in money laundering? How did you let this happen? Why didn't you come to me and ask for help? Sarah swallowed hard, tears now rolling freely down her face. I was afraid. He made me believe that if I told anyone, especially you, things would get much worse. He said I had no choice. And I believed it, because I was terrified, and ashamed. James felt the weight of her words, as if each one were a stone being thrown at him. The pain of betrayal was now mixed with a feeling of disbelief and horror. He wanted to hate her, wanted her to be just a selfish traitor, but the truth was turning out to be much more complicated, and he didn't know how to process it all. So, you got involved in a criminal scheme? Is that it, Sarah? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. And how did you expect this to end? Did you think you could keep hiding this forever? That I would never find out? Sarah broke down, sobbing. I was trapped, James. I didn't know what to do. Every time I tried to leave, he pulled me back. And then, I started to convince myself that I could handle this on my own, that it was just a phase and that everything would work itself out. But it wasn't resolved. And now I've lost everything, including you. James felt the anger rising again. So that's why you lied. Is that why you pretended everything was fine while you continued to get involved with him? You betrayed me, and now you want me to feel sorry because he threatened you? It's not that, she screamed, desperate. I didn't want it to be like this. I know I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. And I know saying this now doesn't change anything, but I was trying to protect you. I knew if he found out I told you something, he would come after you too. There was a moment of absolute silence. James processed what he had just heard, trying to understand the scope of the situation. He felt torn. Part of him wanted to take Sarah in his arms and get her out of that situation, protect her as he always believed his role was. But the other part couldn't ignore the fact that she had lied to him, betrayed his trust in a way that seemed impossible to forgive. I don't know what to make of this, Sarah, he finally said, his voice low, as if exhausted. I thought we were a team, that we could face anything together. But you chose to deal with this alone, and look where that got us. She approached him, her face marked by regret and fear. James, I know I made a mistake. I know nothing I say will make you forget the pain I caused. But please, just this once, help me out of this. I can't do this alone. James closed his eyes, trying to find some clarity in the chaos. He knew that if he got involved, he would end up risking his own safety. But he also knew that, despite everything, a part of him still loved her, and that part hated seeing her so desperate. I'll think about it, he said at last, with a heavy sigh. But if I'm going to help you, I want you to tell me everything. I don't want any more secrets, I don't want any more lies. If you really want me to be by your side, then you're going to have to trust me with that. Sarah nodded, relieved, even though she knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But at least, for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a chance to escape the nightmare she had created. She just didn't know that the price of this chance could be much greater than she imagined, and that the truth that would come to light would bring consequences that neither of them were prepared to face. James spent the next few days in a state of constant internal conflict. He wanted to believe that there was still something to be saved in their marriage, he wanted to help Sarah get out of the hole she had gotten herself into, but the weight of betrayal continued to crush any impulse of empathy that arose. He found himself observing her in silence, trying to decipher her gestures, her looks. It was as if he was meeting a stranger, someone he never really understood. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be consumed by a kind of quiet urgency. She was constantly anxious, as if she expected that at any moment the ground beneath her feet would collapse. Her lover, the man who had promised her an easy and attractive way out of her suffocating routine, was now a looming threat, a cruel reminder of how bad things could get. She knew she had made a mistake, knew James had every right to hate her, but she desperately clung to the hope that he could find a way to forgive her, to help her through the chaos. One night, as they sat in the living room, James broke the silence. He had spent the day thinking about what to do, trying to find some logic in the storm. "I talked to a lawyer," he said, looking at the glass of wine in his hands. Sarah tensed, her eyes wide. "It's not for divorce," he continued, realizing the panic he had caused. "I need to understand what we're dealing with, what the legal implications are, and if there's a way to resolve this." Sarah almost collapsed with relief. "James, she began, but he raised his hand to silence her. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet," he said, his voice cold but contained. "I just wanted to know the truth. And now that I know, I need to figure out what to do with it. It's not as simple as you think, Sarah. Because we're not just talking about the two of us, but something that could completely ruin our lives." She nodded, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "I know. And I'm willing to do anything to make it right. Anything you ask of me." James took a deep breath and stood up, walking around the room. He knew that this situation required a careful solution. As much as he wanted to just cut Sarah out of his life, throw her out of the house and forget that he ever loved her, he knew that the consequences of that decision could be disastrous. If she was involved in a money laundering scheme, and if the authorities found out, their lives would be destroyed anyway. It was a situation that required more than anger, it required cold and strategic analysis. "Does he know you told me?" James asked suddenly, stopping to look Sarah in the eyes. She hesitated for a moment before answering, and James saw in that brief moment the fear spreading across her face. "No. I didn't say anything to him," she finally replied. "But he is smart. If I pull away suddenly, he'll know something is wrong. He will be suspicious. And if he gets suspicious, what happens?" James asked, his expression hardening. He needed to understand the real danger they were facing. "Does he threaten you, threaten me, or worse?" Sarah looked down, unable to bear the weight of James' questions. "I don't know. He said I can't get out of this so easily. That if I tried, he would make sure I regret it." She trembled, remembering the veiled threats he made, always with that calm and confident smile, as if he had absolute control over her. "But I never thought things would get to this point." James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. He knew they were treading on dangerous ground, and that any false move could destroy not only Sarah, but him as well. And that was the part that tormented him. As much as he wanted to see Sarah pay for what she had done, he couldn't ignore the fact that his own safety and stability were at risk. They were all in the same boat, a boat that was about to sink. "I need you to do something for me, Sarah," James said, finally stopping pacing and facing her. "I want you to finish this. Find a way to get away from him without arousing suspicion. Because if he gets suspicious, I'll go after him, and I won't stop until this situation ends. And I promise you, he won't like how this ends." Sarah looked at him, surprised and terrified. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "James, he is dangerous. If he finds out you're getting involved, he'll—" "I don't care what he does," James interrupted her, his voice hard and unforgiving. "I already lost what was most important to me. What else can he take from me? I will no longer live in fear. And neither should you. But that means we're going to need to be smart about it." Sarah felt a mixture of fear and hope rise within her. She knew that James was risking everything by getting involved, and that made her feel even more guilty for what he had caused. But I also knew he was right. They couldn't keep hiding and hoping that everything would work itself out. They needed a plan. The days that followed were filled with tension. James contacted his lawyer again, asking for guidance on what they could do to handle the situation without alerting the authorities, or worse, Sarah's lover. He did not want to involve the police immediately, as this could trigger an unpredictable and dangerous reaction. Meanwhile, Sarah tried to continue her routine, pretending to be normal while her insides were in shambles, always expecting things to explode around her at any moment. Then one night, James got a call. It was from an unknown number, and he hesitated before answering, feeling his stomach turn at the possibility that it was him. When he finally answered, a cold, calculated voice came from the other end of the line, confirming his worst fears. "James, isn't it? I heard you've been asking questions about me. I think we should talk." James felt his entire body freeze, as if every muscle had contracted at once. The voice continued, indifferent and calm, as if it was going about ordinary business. "I suggest you stop this. Sarah and I have an agreement. And if you interfere, I guarantee you will regret it." James knew he was being pulled into a dangerous game, a game he didn't want to play but couldn't avoid. He took a deep breath, trying not to show the fear he felt, and responded firmly. "I'm not the kind of man who handles threats well. And if you think you're going to continue controlling her life, you're sorely mistaken." There was a pause on the other side, and James felt that, for the first time, he had created a crack in the man's facade of confidence. "Be careful what you wish for, James," the voice said, with a slightly darker tone. "You don't know what you're dealing with." James hung up, his hands shaking as he held the phone. He knew the situation was about to escalate in a way he couldn't control. And, for the first time, he realized that he was truly willing to risk everything to ensure that the truth came out, and that Sarah, and he, were free from the bonds that man had created. James felt like he was in the eye of a hurricane. Since the threatening call, he knew there was no more time for hesitation. The game had begun, and he couldn't afford to back down. He spent the next few days devising a plan, one that involved more than simply confronting Sarah's lover. It was a risk, but he was willing to face the consequences to expose what was behind that facade of security and normality that had dominated his life. Sarah was more nervous than ever. She knew the noose was closing in, that things were about to explode in ways she couldn't control. And as she watched James prepare, she didn't know whether to feel fear or relief. Fear for what could happen if things went wrong, and relief for the fact that, finally, there would be an outcome, good or bad, it didn't matter anymore. She couldn't take the uncertainty anymore, the pressure of trying to keep secrets that were already leaking out everywhere. The final meeting was scheduled. James knew he needed to act strategically, so he invited the man to a secluded cafe where they could talk without attracting too much attention. He arrived early, sat calmly and waited. His heart was pounding, but his expression was serene, as if he were in complete control. When the man appeared, James stood up and greeted him as if they were old friends. But his eyes had no heat, they were cold, calculating, as if they had already mapped out a destiny for whoever was approaching. "So here we are," said the man, a relaxed smile that tried to hide his apprehension. "I thought we had an understanding, but it seems like you are more persistent than I imagined." James leaned forward, keeping his gaze fixed on the other man. "I didn't come here to negotiate. I came to make it clear that I will no longer allow you to threaten my life and Sarah's life. And I will do whatever it takes to end this." The man laughed, but there was an underlying tension in his voice. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do? Do you think you can go to the police? I know you're afraid of what this could mean for her, for you. It would be better to accept that some things are out of your control." James remained silent for a moment, absorbing those words. He knew that, in a way, the man was right. Taking the case to the police would risk exposing Sarah to accusations, it would put everything he was still trying to protect at risk. But James had something that the other didn't know, he had already prepared the ground for the outcome, in a way that would guarantee their safety without having to rely solely on the force of the law. "I don't need the police," James said finally, a faint smile appearing on his face. "I just need you. And I need you to understand that if anything happens to me or Sarah, your entire little operation will fall apart. Because I made sure all the evidence of what you're doing is sent to the right people if I disappear." The man blinked, confused for a moment. "What do you mean by that?" He was starting to lose his cool, his confidence crumbling. "I found what you were hiding. The fake contracts, the money transfers, the names of your contacts. It wasn't difficult to find the loose ends," explained James. "You were careful, but not careful enough. I have proof of everything, and it's kept in a safe place. And if something happens to me, or if I see that you continue to pressure Sarah, this evidence will be released to people I'm sure you don't want as enemies." The man was now visibly disturbed. He had underestimated James, and now found himself cornered by someone he thought he could easily intimidate. "You're bluffing," he said, trying to maintain his composure, but James saw the fear in his eyes. "Do you really want to risk it?" James replied calmly, looking straight at him. "If I were you, I would think twice before continuing this charade. If you're smart, you'll leave this town and disappear before anyone comes looking for you." There was a long moment of silence, where only the sound of cups being placed on distant tables filled the air. The man finally looked down. He knew he was defeated, and the anger was visible in his clenched fists. But he also knew that if he tried anything, it could be the end of everything for him. "Okay," he said, standing up. "But know that you and she will have to live with this for the rest of your lives. Remember that things don't end just because you think you win. There are always consequences." James didn't respond, just watched as the man left the cafe, disappearing through the door like a shadow that finally dissipated. He knew there were still risks, that the threat could return in some form, but he felt that, for the first time, he had taken a step in the right direction. "And, above all, I had decided that I would no longer live in fear." When he returned home, he found Sarah waiting for him, nervous and anxious, her eyes full of questions. He walked over and hugged her, something he hadn't done in a long time. She cried, letting out all the tension she had held in for so long. "What happened?" she asked, her voice broken by sobs. "He won't bother us anymore," James said, stroking her hair. "But that doesn't mean we're okay, Sarah. It just means we can start trying to work things out without that shadow always following us." Sarah nodded, knowing the battle was far from over. But for now, just knowing they were free from that immediate threat was an immense relief. She didn't know if James would be able to forgive her, if they could rebuild the life they had before, but she was willing to try, in every way possible. In the months that followed, James began to slowly rebuild his life. He temporarily distanced himself from Sarah, not because he hated her, but because he needed to understand who he was without her. "I needed to see if it was possible to forgive, if it was possible to overcome the pain of betrayal." Sarah, in turn, began seeking help to deal with the issues that got her into that situation in the first place, hoping that one day she could show James that she had changed, that she could be someone different. In the end, James did what he thought he could never do, he found a path to peace. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but he was able to accept that some things in life don't go as planned. And surprisingly, that didn't mean all was lost. He found the strength to move forward, not because of Sarah, but because of himself. Because he deserved a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past, and he decided to give himself that chance. Sarah, on the other hand, had to accept that she might never win back James' love, but that didn't mean her life was over. She finally learned that running away from her problems only led to dead ends, and she began to face her truths with courage. And even though her path was lonely, she was determined to move forward. What did you think of this story? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remember, here, we never support any type of betrayal, but we believe that each choice has its consequences. Until the next story.